Good afternoon to you all. I'm sorry for the slight delay that we had. Of course, in election periods, what we know is that our electioneering politicians, particularly the leader of the opposition and the Premier, find themselves in high demand. So we're pleased. Now, Peter, am I allowed to call you Peter?
Most certainly can, Ross. In fact, Peter's probably the most formal thing I get called these days.
So, thank you very much for joining us. And of course, we're coming from Ghana land today, and we're very privileged to have the opportunity to be on this beautiful land that we live on. On behalf of SACOSS, I pay my respects to elders past and present, and particularly given that we're going potentially broadcasting across South Australia today, respects to elders right across South Australia, and respects to the cultural authority of Aboriginal people across the regions.
Indeed. Look, I too share those sentiments, Ross, but when I say of course, Labor in government sees our responsibility in terms of showing that respect to the Ghana people, having to translate to policy in our mission on the journey towards reconciliation, which of course is ongoing. And we've got a lot of policy in that area, and I'm very grateful to Kai Ma, an initiated Aboriginal man himself, who I desperately hope is the next Minister for Aboriginal Affairs in South Australia.
So we probably won't get a chance to talk in detail a lot about that today, okay, sure. But I'm sure that there are a whole lot of things that will intersect with that as we chat. Now, it's not a couch, so some people out there are going to be a little disappointed there's no couch.
We've got the plot part, which looks quite nice.
It's not a swimming pool.
No, it's not. Thank God.
It's not a debate.
That's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate. We were certainly really hoping that there was going to be an opportunity to have both you and the Premier in the room at the one time, and that the Premier has politely declined a number of attempts to encourage him to do so.
Look, this area of public policy is important to a lot of South Australians. I hope it's important to all South Australians, and elections are ultimately an expression of the people's will at the ballot box. And my biggest frustration in politics, Ross, is actually apathy. I welcome the contest of ideas, and I welcome people with good intent, indeed having different political ideologies. But elections are an opportunity to flesh out those ideas, and that's why on every occasion that I've been offered the opportunity to be on the same stage as Stephen Marshall, I've accepted. Unfortunately, he's declined on almost every single occasion, with the exception of the media debates. So, nonetheless, I very much look forward to the opportunity for you to test our policies and invite an important conversation. Well,
we're very pleased that we've got the chance to talk to you, and again, apologies to those of you that have been waiting online. We know it's been a little extra time. We're going to go a little longer, so there will be an opportunity for us to extend the conversation with the Leader of the Opposition, so we're very grateful to that. So let's just open with the why are you here in a sense, because I'm not sure that necessarily lots of people understand a lot about your background. We've seen adverts on the telly, and that's given us a little bit of insight. But what got you into politics, and what do you think are the key things that you're bringing to the Labor Party if it was to form government?
There's absolutely no doubt that my upbringing at both school, my parents, but also the influence of my grandparents has informed my politics. I didn't grow up in a political household where Mum and Dad were Liberal or Labor per se, but I did grow up in a household where they had a strong conviction around current affairs, and that we have a duty, living in a liberal democracy, to care about the way people vote and how that intersects to public policy and then a better life. And my faith has been important to me. I'm not a very good Catholic. In fact, I'm a pretty bad Catholic, but I did, there was a big effort at home to instill in myself and my brother and sister a sense of social justice, and that social justice mission has been something that motivates me, and in fact has motivated me throughout my working life, and then that sort of translated into political engagement that led me to the Labor Party, and I'm very. It's been an extraordinary privilege to be able to serve others, and obviously there'd be no greater privilege in that regard than being the Premier of the state. And you know, such a responsibility brings with it an extraordinary opportunity to try and do as much as you can for those people that have been less fortunate than people like myself. And that hopefully comes through in the public policy platform that we're taking to the election. But that sense of service to others, that sense of giving others opportunity that through no fault of their own have been denied it, is a pretty powerful motivator to why I'm Labor, and why I'm very excited about the election.
Now, one of the things that I've noticed happens to leaders particularly is that they move into the role and they bring those very same kind of aspirations often, but the party and the political processes tend to force some of that stuff out of you. Have you got thoughts about things that you would do to keep your focus and keep your passion?
That's a good question. I think the best way to do that is a couple of things. Remain grounded with people around you that are happy to speak truth to power. Something that I've found in various roles of authority that I've had is that you know, people often act in deference to people with authority, and while respect, I guess, is part of our human nature, what you really need is people around you who are willing to speak truth to power, and you've got to create a culture around you to have people do that. So if you've got an idea that's not consistent with your policy or not consistent with what motivates us, then they call it out. But also being grounded in terms of family and friends is important to me. But the most important thing, of course, is getting out there and talking to people. I've never been, I haven't been a politician very long, but in the time that I have been in politics, I thoroughly enjoy the opportunity to get out there and talk to people in all guises. And something that I'm conscious of, and that's why we have a policy to address it, is that when you assume roles of responsibility, inevitably there's a call on your time constantly, and that tends to be always from people with power themselves. Big business leaders, big lobby groups, they're constantly calling on your time. And that's important because they're often they advocate for significant and important causes in the state. Even business causes are important, of course, but you've also got to make time and have the discipline to make time to talk to people who don't have a powerful lobby, people who don't stroll the halls of Parliament, people who don't make donations to political parties. And that's something I've always tried to do, and something I would very much hope to do if I'm lucky enough to be Premier.
SACOSS, of course, has been 75 years of trying to pound the halls of Parliament House,
which you do well.
Trying to make sure that the voices of people that are experiencing disadvantage and poverty in South Australia are apparent and available. And we will continue to do that, of course. But we would also love to have some of the sets of resources that some of those other lobby groups do have available to them.
Well, but the thing on that, Ross, is and SACOSS and yourself obviously do that incredibly well. The thing is, though, like, nothing informs a politician's view of the world, though, than first-hand engagement with people having that experience. The reason why I'm late, and apologies for that, I was just with a bunch of nurses, and you hear from nurses' representatives and they make the argument powerfully, but then you start taking the time to talk to people who are doing the work on the ground and living this on a daily basis, and it's impossible for you not to be moved by it. And that's equally true in all gamuts, but including the people who have experienced social disadvantage.
So let's turn to the campaign.
Yep.
Because we're now full on into the campaign mode.
It's good. It's exciting.
It's a happening thing. March 19th, in fact, we know full well that a lot of people are likely to be casting their votes early.
Yes.
So for you, what do you think the biggest issues are in the campaign?
Look, health is top of mind. There's no escaping that. I think the ramping crisis that South Australians are well familiar is now so out of control that it's actually not just having a direct impact on people who work in the system or people who call on the health system. It's actually impacting people who have to call 000. I mean, ambulances aren't rolling up on time anymore. And that's because of the ramping crisis, and that needs urgent attention, and we've made it clear that that's a fundamental priority. And I think one of the things that's contributed to that being top of mind in voters' minds is COVID as well. COVID has, I think, increased people's consciousness on the value of public health. The one thing though that worries me, and I've said this publicly repeatedly, I've said this publicly repeatedly at business forums, not just saying this because I'm talking to SACOSS, is something that worries me about all of that in the COVID context is what I describe as the dark underbelly of COVID, where, I think economic inequity was starting to get the attention it deserved pre-COVID. People were looking at what was happening with Trump, people were looking at what was happening in Western Europe, major political parties getting smashed at the elections. They were seeing what was happening in Eastern Europe with the rise of nationalism and other political forces. Even in Australia, we had 5 prime ministers in 5 years. There was a lot of political dysfunction, and my assessment was that was aided and fueled by economic inequity, and there was a growing body of economic research out there saying that that's actually got its own consequences economically. It was getting traction in a way that I think was absolutely appropriate. But COVID's come along and sort of blocked out the sun. It's the only thing we've talked about for 2 years. Meanwhile, that problem of economic inequity has actually been exacerbated during COVID, which we can talk about. And I think that's got to be an important subject matter, not just at the state election, but also the federal election, because no one wants to come out the end of COVID with a society that was less fair than the one before it.
And there's no doubt that the investments in the tertiary end of the health system might be important, but one of the things that we have repeatedly talked about, and along with a number of our colleagues, is the investments that need to be made at the community level. In investments in illness prevention and investments in that public health stuff. And as you say, the public health has been brought forward as a clear, highly protective, very important mechanism for us as a community and as a population to protect our health. At some point in time, it would be nice to hear big investments going into those spaces as well.
Look, we all know that prevention is better than cure. And the nature of the hospital system is that it's right at the other end. If you go to hospital, something's wrong with you. Something that I've got strong views about, I was the health minister for a few months before the election, and my political opponents trying to make it sound as though I was responsible for a whole bunch of decisions. I wasn't even in Parliament before, but that's politics. But the one thing I did learn in that 5-odd month period that I was the minister was the way that our hospital system doesn't work with our primary healthcare system. And so much of that effort is around primary healthcare if we want to get to people who are particularly disadvantaged, because we know social disadvantaged is a very close link towards health and hygiene and general well-being, and so much of that effort should be delivered through the primary healthcare system, but it doesn't even talk to the hospital system in the way it should. And I think that's an issue that requires national reform, and something that, if I'm lucky enough to be Premier, I'd seek to elevate attention towards.
So one of the other things that has been profound in the COVID context is we suddenly all realised how important a digital connection was. And indeed, SACOSS has been saying for a number of years now that digital inclusion is the new face of poverty. That in a sense, if you're not connected, if you don't have the access to the data, if you don't have the means at your disposal, and you don't have the literacy, you're going to find yourself in a position where you could easily fall out. Does the Labor Party have any propositions around what it might seek to do in order to advance people's digital inclusion?
We'll have more to say as the campaign goes on, Ross, and as you know, the timing of this is in one way unfortunate because we've still got 3 weeks of the campaign.
That's all right, you're allowed to announce today, you know, we'd be happy for that.
Look, what I can draw people's attention to is that Labor and government was serious about trying to make digital accessibility a priority, and the free Wi-Fi network in Adelaide, amongst other areas, is an example of that. The one thing though that I'd say is nothing is more important than trying to think a lot further ahead when it comes to literacy, digital literacy and so forth, and that's why we have made a big policy emphasis on early childhood education. Now I know a 3-year-old preschool feels like a long way from someone who might be in their mid-20s and suffering from digital literacy or lack of access. But at some point we need to have governments making efforts at the front end to set us up for the long term. And I'm going to talk about this a fair bit today, and forgive me if people get bored of it, but all of the international research tells us that one of the best ways to address disadvantage, particularly intergenerational disadvantage, is through early childhood education. It's like the most powerful thing that can be done. You get your most bang for your buck out of that than anything else. And we've committed to a plan to have universal access for free 3-year-old preschool by 2026, which is a pretty big, bold commitment. If I'm honest, it hasn't got as much attention politically as I'd like. We announced it last year, and that feels like an eternity ago in COVID time, but COVID again has blocked out the sun. But this is a massive policy that is very much our principal foundation policy about trying to address not just social disadvantage but also economic inequity.
So what do you think that investment would reveal or enable?
Okay, a number of things. Firstly, so to just give your viewers some context, the OECD average of participation in early childhood education is 71%. 71% of all 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds participate in early childhood preschool across the OECD. In Australia, that average is 15%. The OECD average of investment in early childhood education is 0.6% of GDP. 0.6%. In Australia, it's 0.2%. Now, that sounds like statistical gobbledygook, but we are massively underinvesting in early childhood education. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because early childhood education not just sets all kids up to be in a better position when they hit reception to go on their journey towards literacy and becoming good in maths and science, but it's also fundamentally important about getting access in terms of early intervention with children who have particular needs. They might need access to speech pathology, they might need access to occupational therapists, they might need even child psychologists and other issues, early intervention around. But you can't do that unless you get access to those kids. And often those things, that early intervention can make a massive difference to the outcome and set that kid that child on a completely different trajectory for the rest of their lives is missed out on. And by the time they get to school and it gets picked up on, it's too late. So that's why it's not just a powerful economic lever about getting a better education outcome in the long term, it's also a social lever as well.
So let's talk about another thing that I'm sure you won't be surprised I want to talk about, and that's housing.
Yeah.
Because having a safe, secure home is fundamental, and it's you know, and we've been out today talking with the last cost of our last cost of living analysis, talking about the rental affordability crisis. And of course, over the last 2 decades, we've seen the proportion of public housing in the rental market reduced from nearly 10% to down to below 7%. And we think as a consequence that's one of the influences that's causing the rental affordability crisis that we're faced with right now. Have you got a view about where the role that public housing investment, the role that it plays in the economy and in the rental market more broadly?
I absolutely do have a view. What is it?
Tell me about it.
So look, I feel about it strongly. Like my father worked at the housing trustees in basically the entirety of his working life. Public housing and the value of public housing is something that was very, very important to my dad, and naturally we discussed around the home. There's 2 things about public housing. It's not just social infrastructure, it's also economic infrastructure. I mean, people often forget that it was Playford that established the Housing Trust as a key economic policy, not just as a social policy. Notwithstanding that, the way public housing has been utilised by government has evolved since Playford. But that's not to say that it doesn't have a fundamentally important role into the future. Now, there is no doubt there is a housing crisis, not just in South Australia, but across the nation at the moment. We've seen a lot of people, a lot of the investor class are cashing in, and the people who are buying those homes often end up being owner-occupiers, which then displaces another piece of accommodation from the rental market, and hence supply is diminishing and prices going up. Public housing can perform a fundamental role in regulating, or not regulating, but having an impact on the market and ameliorating that effect. And government can do that in a way that the private sector can't, sometimes by having a deliberate policy to invest in housing at an more affordable price point. And that's where public housing comes in. Now, you're going to ask, well, what's our policy on that? As you reasonably should. We have got a public housing policy that we will be announcing over the next few weeks. What I would say top line is, I think there has been an underinvestment in public housing, not just by this government, but also the former Labor government. And I'm happy to say that publicly, so I'm not laying all the blame at the feet of the Marshall Liberal government. We have to acknowledge there's been an underinvestment for some time. I would love to see housing policy, public housing policy, form more of a greater part of the picture at a federal level. And I have seen some interesting, well, not interesting, I've seen more than that. I've seen a genuine commitment to this policy area from federal Labor, which I welcome, but we are underinvested in public housing.
So can we be assured that in addition to any additional public housing that you might announce potentially in your policy, could you at least assure us today that we wouldn't, if you were to become Premier, one of the things that we wouldn't see is any further decline? Because that seems to us to have been, over the last 2 decades, we've seen this massive decline in housing stock, let alone new builds.
Yeah. The answer to that question is yes. I think there's an argument for policies that see large housing trust blocks with a single dwelling on them that's a 3 or 4 bedroom or 3 bedroom home. I can absolutely see the merit in that being turned into 2 dwellings to cater for the demand that exists. That's not what you're referring to. You're talking about a net loss in housing stock. No, we wouldn't want to pursue that sort of policy in government. I think that's been a mistake in the past. The other thing that matters, of course, is getting public housing policy right in the context of where it goes. And there have been errors in the past, and I'm not just talking about, I'm talking about generations, decades ago, where very high concentrations of public housing all in one location has policy deficiencies, and we don't want to replicate that mistake again either.
And some of there'd be a number of our regional members who are sitting listening to this today, and people right across the regions of South Australia that are saying, look, and even business people that are wanting to get businesses established, and the fact that there is no housing in those regions that is, affordable to people on modest incomes, let alone low incomes, means that people don't get the economic development.
Well, look at Bordertown. It's a really good example of that. It's an immediate example of that, where there is a housing crisis there. There is growing demand for labour through industry in Bordertown, through abattoir, for instance, and it's not just up a town. I think Narracourt's got a similar problem, and they need additional houses, but there is market failure around the arrangements there, because lots of the workforce there is through skilled migration. And market failure means that there isn't enough housing stock, and that means not just a social consequence but an economic consequence as well.
Enormous. Let's move to the issues of water, something that we've talked about. Are you surprised that there are citizens in communities across South Australia that right at the moment still don't have access to clean, reliable drinking water?
Absolutely.
Because, and I guess we've heard from the government in the last couple of days that they've got commitments that are moving towards addressing that. But I think for most people it would be a surprise that we live in a country and a state as wealthy as this one, and we still have people that don't have access to drinking water.
Stunning.
Are you prepared to commit to sort of extending the work, if you were to form the next government, to continue the work that we've been doing with this government, to make sure that we address that issue and we get it sorted?
I mean, we are capable of providing access to clean drinking water as a state. We're a first world state and a first world country. We have an exceptional standard of living. I think most South Australians would expect that the provision of such an elementary service would be provided for. And it's not just important for individuals' well-being, but again, without access to water, how can you have investment? So it's an essential service that government has to accept responsibility for.
So one of the other things we've talked about a lot is the concession system. And, SACOSS did a piece of work a few months ago looking at what's happening with the concession system, and it's fair to say that it's a bit of a dog's breakfast. That there are different eligibility requirements, there are different administration arrangements, and so one of the things that we're interested to know is whether, if you were to form the next government, that you'd commit to a proper, decent review of the concession system.
Yes, that's something I can commit to definitively today, Ross. And the reason why I say that is because, principally through your advocacy, we are satisfied that there is a problem that needs to be fixed here. And access to concessions matters, particularly, for people who are desperately trying to participate in the community, who want to get out and access, or want to get out and something as elementary as going to a job interview, for instance, can sometimes be denied the opportunity to do so. Concessions are a legitimate policy tool to increase engagement. And government's job is to provide access to key services, not just water, but key services. Take public transport, for instance, in a way that is accessible for people who need it most, which benefits everybody. And we are satisfied there is a problem that needs to be fixed here. I can't tell you exactly what that solution is, but it's something that is going to take, and it is complicated. It's not. There isn't an easy fix here. If there was, it would have happened. But we can commit to that review that you've been advocating for, and I think it's important.
So the other thing, you have made an announcement about public transport and people on seniors cards having access to free public transport at all hours. Now I just have to make the observation that maybe in a few years, once I've saved up a bit more for my retirement, I too could be one of those people that could get access to a seniors card, but I suspect I'm going to be in pretty reasonable circumstances. Has there been any thought given to the idea of extending that free access to some of those other groups of people that are going to be in much more difficult circumstances, like people on income support benefits and things?
I'm not in a position to make that commitment clearly, but that is something that we're open-minded to. I mean, when we were developing our policy for seniors card holders, we did discuss the fact that there'd be people who would get access to that benefit who have more means than others. But our policy is also about driving people using public transport, getting off the roads, coming into town. It's also an acknowledgement of the fact that seniors are performing different roles than what was the case 30 years ago. A lot of seniors are doing child caring, the necessity to have two incomes these days. When I say the necessity, the reality that so many households have two incomes these days, single parents have to work, grandparents are assisting with children. It's an acknowledgement of the changing role of grandparenting in many instances, and that obviously overwhelmingly are seniors. And that's something that informed our policy. But in terms of your the challenge you identify, that is something that we are willing to engage in.
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck us about the whole concessions arrangement that there was still pensioners were mostly eligible for most concessions. Yeah. But in fact, people who were reliant principally on wages but were living below the poverty line don't have some means of access, or someone who's reliant on the very inadequate job seeker payment doesn't have the same levels of access to many of those concessions, and yet they would be really important things. And indeed, one of the things that I was even talking with a group of people from the refugee settlement network this morning, and one of the things they were making was the observation about people who don't have ambulance cover. And won't call an ambulance even though they're so anxious, because they're so worried about what the costs would be for them as a. It's
a scary proposition. I mean, but take the job seeker, for instance, who's desperately doing everything they can to re-enter the labour market. You want them to be able to get access to go to a job interview, and you put that argument with me recently, and it's one that's incredibly persuasive. The thing about job keeper, help me out here. There was job keeper and job seeker.
Yep.
It instantaneously lifted hundreds of thousands of South Australians out of poverty.
Yeah, that COVID allowance was a fantastic kind of asset for that moment in time.
It was extraordinary, and that had a really material impact in the standard of living of so many people in an utterly positive way, not just for those individuals but for whole communities. While we can't replicate job seeker, and that's not going to happen anytime soon, what government needs to do is what can we do that is affordable within the budget, that won't have what can it do that doesn't have a massive impact on the budget, that will make a big material difference in a practical way? And that's where this falls into that category, and we're willing to examine it.
I guess the thing I'd be asking of you is that if you were to become the Premier, no matter who the federal government is, will you hold the torch up for all of those people that are on that kind of inadequate payment?
Yes. I've already publicly stated that I think New Start is too low. And I don't arrive at that view lightly, I might add. The increased, I didn't arrive at that position quickly either, but having spoken to a lot of people in these circumstances, understanding what they're going through, understanding that almost always it's not there through any fault of their own. It is too low. And what COVID showed us is the power of what it can be when it's higher. Now, like I said, job seeker is not going to return to those levels, but New Start is too low.
Something that has made the news over the last 12 months, despite the COVID situation, was the terrible circumstances of Anne-Marie Smith. And of course, as a state, there's been a major shift in the way in which the disability system is organised, and one of the key ambitions in shifting the way the disability sector was organised and how it's funded was to make sure that people living with disability actually got access to the supports that they needed to be able to live safely, securely and well in their local community. Now, a part of that is enabled when we have really strong safeguards in place.
Yes.
And some of those safeguards are about the advocacy that's available to argue the toss.
Always.
Repeatedly over the last decade, I think, there's been an underinvestment in many of those advocacy efforts that would have potentially been available to provide some protection to Anne-Marie Smith. And indeed we had that awful circumstance just a couple of weeks ago for the man who was, so in that context, I'm interested, what would your Labor government, should it arise, be thinking about doing in order to build the relationship with people living with disability and their broader interests?
Well, we were, post the Anne-Marie Smith tragedy, we were critical of the government around the capacity for the independent community visitor scheme to continue to function, notwithstanding the transfer to the NDIS. The state government took the view that this was something that was the responsibility of the Commonwealth, not the state, as that transfer occurred. I reject that view. And so, of course, that puts the heat on us coming into an election. Well, what's our policy to change that? And we are committed to changing it. We have got a policy on to address the community visitor scheme arrangement. We think that it should be in place and that there should be the power for people to be able to inspect, probably the wrong word, but to check on people in a proactive way to ensure that the Anne-Marie Smith tragedy doesn't get repeated. Make no mistake, I think the NDIS is probably one of the biggest policy achievements we've seen at the federal level in a long, long time. In fact, someone asked me the other day, said, what are the two massive policy reforms that we've seen in the last 20 years? And the only two I could really think of that have been really substantial and life-changing is the GST, and people can argue the merit of that. It's a separate conversation about a regressive tax, but is the NDIS. I think it's a major piece of reform that is outstanding. It's got its complexities. A lot of people have got frustrations with it, and it needs a lot more work. But it is a massive step in the right direction. And just as was the case with Medibank and Medicare, it took time to get right, and that's what the NDIS is going through at the moment, including questions about whether or not it's underfunded.
So a number of people, I have to say, I'm just monitoring some of the questions that are coming through, and a number of people are talking about particularly disability advocacy and the need to make sure that people living with disability do have access, and some of those existing advocates, like Our Voice SA, and very small enabling groups of people that are living with disability who have come together in solidarity with each other in order to argue the toss and to make sure that things are better for some of the people that they know.
And they deserve great recognition. And in government, we are, Nat Cook, our shadow minister in the area, who I have no doubt most of the people who are watching this would know. She is an outstanding woman with a great passion for the area, and seldom do I go a day without getting a text message from Nat in some form or another. I have in contact with Nat, advocating the cause of people with disability in the state, and key agencies and support groups that facilitate that. And you know, I have every confidence that if there are things that aren't being done that should be done, that can be done, in allowing that advocacy to flourish, then that will facilitate it.
And we'll certainly have a bit more of an opportunity. We have, interestingly, got a debate, and it will be a debate that I'll be moderating with both the Shadow Minister, but also important, with the Minister for Human Services, in Michelle Lansing.
That's important. I mean, it's been hard to find where Michelle is recently, so you've obviously had a bit of success, and we applaud that effort. That's a cheap shot.
I think that's March the 2nd that we're aiming for. That 12:15. We might even, you know, be able to explore some of that stuff more fully. I guess some of the other questions that are coming through is, again, in the disability context, there's a lot of anxiety about people eligible for the NDIS are potentially eligible to get support with some housing supply, but the great majority of people living with disability in our community are, just like the rest of us, struggling to get into the rental market. Do you imagine that there would be anything you'd be doing that would specifically target some of those particularly vulnerable groups?
I think the best thing we can do is just increase the supply. I mean, the housing trust, or, you know, public housing policy that has more supply means there's more availability for the people that need it most, and it's always a responsibility of the Public Housing Authority, call it whatever you will, the Housing Trust, SA Housing, to prioritise, deliberately prioritise people's access to those limited resources by need. And that's something that we support, but the easiest way we can help them is increase the supply, which I'm not making any announcements on today.
Okay. We look forward to hopefully hearing some announcements before now in the election.
No doubt.
Make sure you get them out early so that people who are not going to be voting on voting day are in a position to understand what you're offering.
Well understood.
Yeah. So we've got a question here from Amy, who identifies herself as a renter and a trade unionist. I was at a recent forum of renters in West Torrens, and there were stories of rental homes with no insulation, ceiling and wall cracks, ancient appliances, and no chance of keeping a house cool in summer or warm in winter. But Tom Cootes and Tonus could not commit to minimum energy efficiency standards for rental properties. I want to know, why are minimal rental standards different from minimal wages, which presumably Labor supports? They're both about saying, if you want to do business, earn money from capital, these are certain minimums you need to abide by.
Good question. When you say rentals, I presume rentals in the private market as much as the public.
Well, I suspect my knowledge of some of the public housing estate is that it's not been the subject of good maintenance, and so there's a major issue there.
Maintenance issues in public housing is a big problem, and again, Federal Labor has made some important announcements in that regard to assist in that endeavour. I think what I would say about energy efficiency and so forth, we went to the last election with when I say we, Labor went to the last election with a very substantial policy about putting solar panels on roofs on public housing homes. I thought it was a good policy. It's unfortunate that we haven't seen the government pursue it with the same gusto as what we would have. In terms of the general question about putting regulatory requirements on new builds in terms of energy efficiency, this is something I grapple with. I think it's about getting the balance right. We don't want a situation where only people with means get to live in efficient, cool houses, right? And everyone else misses out. But at the same time, we don't want to sort of restrain supply of additional houses in the public housing market or in the rental market more broadly because of additional cost burdens as a result of increasing that supply. And this is where I struggle. That the truth is it's about a balance. If the government unilaterally put a regulation in place that says every home that's ever built, owner-occupied or investment for rental, must meet this standard, and it was unilateral and was of the highest possible standard, that would increase the price and that would reduce the supply. That is an unfortunate reality now. While some people might see such a policy as visionary, it's important we think through exactly how that plays out for people that need it most. So it's about getting the balance right. And I don't think that's been achieved in the past, but we've got to pursue it into the future.
One of the things that I know has been said to me is that when we don't pay attention to those things. So right at the moment, I think the standing policy for housing authority properties is that they don't install any cooling or heating facilities. And indeed, there's no obligations on a private renter to do so either, or a private landlord to do so. And so what that leaves many people doing is using sources of heat or cooling that are incredibly inefficient and incredibly costly, and that of course ends up in the cost stack about how much it costs to even keep the house running, let alone to live in it with some level of comfort, let alone to be able to enjoy the comfort and benefits. And of course we're ahead of us. We see things like climate change.
Yes, absolutely.
And we're kind of looking at that and thinking, we have to do something now, that we're a bit like the story about why we would invest in our children, and why we should be. We need to be building something now into the way that we build our houses so that we can be prepared 10 years down the track.
Look, absolutely. And look, efficiency requirements on homes is improving dramatically. Has been for some time, but we've got a long way to go. The best thing government can do on climate change, though, in my view, Ross, that's where I think we do need visionary and bold policy, because South Australia's gone from being a world leader in terms of investment in renewables to actually lagging the rest of the nation in terms of new builds and new investments in renewable energy, which I think is unfortunate. And we've got a big plan in this regard with our hydrogen plan, which takes a big upfront investment in terms of capital from government. But we're unapologetic about that. We want it to be we want to be a leader in this regard. It will provide cheaper power for South Australians, particularly industrial customers, but all South Australians ultimately. But what we're really trying to do is make a big play in clean energy so that we've got the benefit of being a world leader, of being a first mover. Now, critics have said to me from the right, have said, well, look, that's not something the government should be doing, that's something that the private sector should be doing. I reject that. People made the same criticism when we made the investment in the big battery. Now that everyone's following suit, the same will be true with hydrogen, in my view. And the thing about that investment that we make, I've made a commitment that it'll be a publicly owned business enterprise called Hydrogen Power South Australia. So this will be a publicly owned asset operating for the people, and that will have a material impact on the end user from not just having hopefully access to cheaper energy, but cleaner energy.
Couple of questions that are more related to the sector, I suppose. And we note, of course, you've made an announcement around a commitment to explore or follow through on portable long service leave scheme. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what that announcement means?
Yeah, so South Australia has been a leader when it comes to long service leave for some time, depending on your perspective. I think
Well, I have perspective that I'm a bit older.
So this is something that we've been a leader on. The thing about long service leave is it's traditionally seen through the context of industrial relations policy, which it ultimately is, which is now by and large the responsibility of the Commonwealth. But long service leave legislation is actually still the responsibility of the states. And South Australia has it does have the most generous long service leave arrangement in the country, where we provide 13 weeks long service leave after 10 years of service, which is a lot in comparison to other places. Now, I think that's a good thing. The thing about long service leave is that less people are getting access to it. Less and less people are getting access to it because the nature of the labour market is changing. People are less likely to be in the same job for 10 years than what was the case previously, or 7 years to get pro rata. And there's a lot of people in the disability services sector that just never get it. They never get it, and all they're doing is out there serving the community in some of the most demanding jobs that are out there, but also some of the more modestly remunerated jobs that are out there. And I do think that that represents a failure in the policy, that so many people would miss out. And we see that the community service sector can be a powerful, powerful test case about what we can do with portable long service leave, and we've made a commitment to actively examine that in government thoroughly. We've made a commitment in terms of how we're going to invest in order to achieve that. There's a great campaign that has been undertaken by
some of the union movement, some of the social services sector,
and that's close to my heart because I've seen so many good changes happen when those two sectors come together and advocate for change, and we want to see that occur.
Yeah. Now we're getting close to the end of our time in this chat. That doesn't mean that there mightn't be other times to chat. Look, one of the continuing issues, and it's particularly acute at the moment, is that we have some very big strategic workforce issues across the sector. And I'm wondering what a Labor government would do in relation to things like training and attraction and retention and remuneration of workers in our sector.
Well, that's why policies like looking at the portable long service leave is so important, because that actually does represent a material benefit to people working in the sector that they might not get working somewhere else potentially. But look, there is a structural failure in the labour market, Ross. We've got a situation where employers and businesses are crying out for people like never before. Doesn't matter, that's across everything. Public sector, private sector, non-government sector, crying out for people. That represents a particular risk to the non-government sector, where margins are thin, operating on tight budgets, and accounting for wages growth is going to be a difficult exercise if that presents itself. Notwithstanding the fact that I like seeing a bit of wages growth out there, because I don't think there's been enough for about 20 years. But if you get me started on that, I'll fire up. But so we've got a structural failure in that. We've got people calling out for things, but we've also got the highest unemployment rate in the nation. We've got the worst participation rate in the mainland. We've got the highest underemployment rate in the country. We don't talk about underemployment enough. People always hear about having the worst unemployment rate in the nation in South Australia. We've got the worst underemployment rate in the nation. Big problem. So why the two? Why constantly us having one of the worst performing labour markets in the country on underemployment, unemployment and the participation rate, yet people crying out for more skills and labour? And the answer is we've got a structural failure, and the only solution that ever works in this regard is education, training and skills. Plain and simple. Like, governments try and stimulate demand for labour, that's got its place, but in the long term the best thing we can do is give people skills. And what we've seen is underinvestment in TAFE. We've seen a declining performance on school-age performance, on average school-age performance academically, according to PISA. And we've also got the university sector, I think, rather than working with each other, working against each other sometimes. And we've got a substantial policy to try and address each and every one of those things. And that actually represents the best chance to address economic inequity in the long term as well.
Our sector's relationship to government is crucial, we believe, and both from the perspective of the provision of services, but also for advice to government about what's the most important things to be done and what will deliver the best policy outcomes. Now, we note that the current government's cut funding to several peak bodies. over the life of the government. Have you got a view about how you would want to see the sector, the government and the sector's relationship if you were to form government?
Well, we won't be cutting funding. I can make that commitment to you, Ross. We won't be cutting funding to in these circumstances. I mean, government funding to key organisations that provide that advice to government is important. And we don't want to replicate the cuts that the government has introduced. I think they've been unfortunate. Notwithstanding that, the most important thing is access, right? Which goes back to the point that we were making earlier. And we want to be a government that is providing access to those who need it most, not just those who have the loudest voice.
Okay, so you're in the elevator, you've got punter in front of you, and you've got 30 seconds because the elevator is going to get to the top of the building, and you want to say, okay, well, here's what you get if you vote for me and my government.
A long-term vision that ensures that the legacy of COVID isn't a bad memory of mask wearing and restrictions, but instead using that post-COVID opportunity to embark on genuine change, reducing economic inequity through investments in education, but also delivering a better outcome for public services, particularly in areas of health. The legacy of COVID, if the legacy of COVID is just going back to where we were before, it'd be the biggest missed opportunity of our lifetime. We've got to use this opportunity to use the big levers of public policy, and that's why I'm prioritising health by not proceeding with the basketball stadium. That's why I want to see cleaner, greener energy in our state by pursuing the hydrogen opportunity with our hydrogen jobs plan. But most importantly for me is the power of education to change people's lives, and we're going to do it in the early years, and we're going to do it for everyone. And I say that to you in my pitch, knowing that those people can't vote. In fact, the people who will benefit from it won't be voting for 15, 18 years' time. So if you want to see long-term policy and long-term vision, we are presenting that option in this election.
There you go. Can I just say thank you very much for taking the time to share that stuff with us. I think that that's been very instructive. The invitation is still out there for the Premier. If he's interested and prepared, I'd be really happy to do a one-on-one with you.
And I'll be happy to debate you if you're willing to.
And can I remind you that there is a debate coming down the track. Can I say thank you to all of you who have joined us today online. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but I hope you've found this a helpful and instructive conversation. And look, I think the really important thing for all of us in this election is to be trying to understand where the policies that either major party is bringing to the table and how they will impact on the people that we worry about most. So we hope that that's been a helpful way of laying some of that stuff out today. So thanks once again,
Ross,
Peter.
and thank you for all your hard work at SACOSS. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.